Another week, another F major added second chord. In this case, another Will Wiesenfeld review. You may remember some many months ago I recorded his then. I am not speaking all today. You may remember some many months ago I reviewed his then new record as Geotic, Abysma, which I listened to the review just to make sure I remembered. I gave it a B- because it was pleasant but didn't leave much of an impression. And as a matter of fact, I listened to it again this week in advance of this review, and I barely remember any of it. I remember it slightly better than I did then, but even then I was complaining that I was listening to a lot in preparation review, and I was just not remembering it well. And that has not changed. But here we are, and he has released a new record under his primary alias, Baths. It's been about 3 weeks, and it's called Romaplasm, this new record. I gave sort of a compressed timeline of what Baths had been during the Geotic record, but I'll refresh you and add some new information. So Baths came out 2010 with Cerulean, one of my favorite records, and then came out in 2013 with Obsidian, which is good, but I didn't like it as much. Cerulean had been sort of a weird, skewed hip-hop record. Now that I think about it, it has very strong, sort of post-Los Angeles Flying Lotus vibe to it. And the beats and the chopping of the samples and so on. Whereas Obsidian was composed of more cohesive songs almost, with something closer to like structures. I don't know, but I said that he was approaching the skewed pop music, and Cerulean was more skewed and Obsidian was more pop, except Obsidian was also very dark because he got E. coli and he was sad. And there's just this very oppressive atmosphere of darkness and almost comical self-loathing. I find it difficult to get into the record because it's just too much at times. But then he released an EP called Ocean Death, which was similarly dark and similarly tight, but had less, I don't know, it felt like it had less emotional hand-wringing and writhing on the ground in pain, which made it better. Okay? So now he has Romaplasm, 4 years after Obsidian, 3 years after Ocean Death, less than a year after his very smooth, very well-produced, very good-sounding, but not necessarily memorable Abysma as Geotic. So where do I begin here? Okay, so Baths is still working mostly in electronics. There's still, the drums are programmed, and there's still a lot of sequenced synthesizer work. Not as much sample stuff, not as much looping going on top of things and being sort of off-kilter. Much closer sonically to Obsidian. That's just the direction his work is heading now, and I have made peace with that. Like Obsidian and like Abysma, it sounds good, it is well produced, it is well polished. Unlike Abysma, it has corners. Thank heaven it has corners. A song like Atom Copies is just full of personality and energy, and it drives forward because it grabs your attention while it does that. Superstructure's like that too. It's not as dark as Obsidian lyrically. There's still a lot of vulnerability, a lot of openness. Something like Out very evidently confronts, insecurities of sexuality, and, something like Coitus is, there's a vulnerability and a longing there. But there's a lot of hope as well, as opposed to, ugh, I have E. coli and everything is bad now, which, was valid, artistically valid. It was hard, it was inaccessible for me. It was emotionally inaccessible, and this record is not emotionally inaccessible. Also, unlike Abysma, and I'm drawing comparisons left and right here, but the man has enough work that I can do that. And Abysma is on my mind because I listened to it in preparation, and because this record has corners every now and then, songs are allowed to have different shapes. They're allowed to sound different from one another in a way that is satisfying. A song like I Form, which has sort of lilt to it, sounds quantitatively different and therefore makes a different impression than something like Superstructure, which there's this big energy and it's a big song that could really get a crowd moving. or something like Wilt, which has a bit of obsidian-like darkness, but not necessarily as much of it, and is offset, of course, by the presence of a song like Out, which in the first line includes the word exuberance in the first line even. Is it perfect? No. I think the first couple songs are a little too bright, a little too happy. I appreciate the balance and extra solar, but not as good for me, I think. The later songs, which have a greater richness, it grows well. The record grows well from point A to point B. And I think Broadback is, I don't know. I like it, but not as much. It's the bit where he's yelling, "I don't want you to die" at the end, which is, you know, again, a valid artistic choice, but reminds me a little too much of the bits I didn't like of Obsidian. They say that there's a big reference, influence from video games and anime on this record, but I don't know anything about video games or anime, so I can't comment on that, unfortunately. There are other things that I might mention. I might mention how this sounds, because I haven't really done a great job with that. It is still sort of skitterish. It is a weird pop record. There's still a strong dance ability to it. He has a weird voice. His voice is fine. He spends a lot of time in the chest area, but he's always had this sort of distinctive falsetto that I've always loved, but I recognize might be a little too squirrely, a little too squealy for other people. I don't know. I like it. And I like how his voice is expressive. I don't know. There's a lot of the piano curly cues, which I have loved in his work ever since his first record. In like, I love the piano loops in Wilt and in I Form, and it does a lot of good emotive work, the piano, in Coitus. He says it's his primary instrument. It's good that he uses it. It shows up in good places. But yes, and there's a lot of strings on it. There's a full string quartet on Coitus, and especially on Human Bog as well. There's a string quartet there. Human Bog and Atom Copies are the standouts. The first being the more reflective. And lyrically, that song ruins me with its rawness and its uncertainty. And Atom Copies is the more frantic, and it's big, and it's energetic, and this is a very confident record. There are risks, and they pay off, but there's also a lot of, I know I can do this, and I'm doing it. And that also pays off in a slightly different, but still very valid way. I approve of this record. Whereas Abysmal was slightly forgettable and gotten a B-, I'm going to give this an A-. I'm going to say it's playing with the big boys record-wise this year. You might, if you like Bjork's Homogenic, I would recommend this. I can draw a direct line from the expanse of something like Bachelorette to something like Abscond. Or, no, not Abscond. I Form, maybe? There's something I can't put my finger on. Definitely between Pluto and Atom Copies and Superstructure. Definitely between Unravel and Lev, another highlight, and Human Bog. It's a good record. Go listen to it. The year's drawing to a close, and I think this might be the last of the good records. Certainly this is the last review of the year. I might do a Songs of the Year later on in December, but yeah. A-, Romaplasm, Anticon Records. I am well satisfied.